Right, we are ready to go live. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the 2020 U.S. Census. My name is Zainab Joudry. I'm the director for CAIR's office in Maryland, and I want to welcome all of you to today's conversation. This is obviously a very important topic for very many reasons, and we want to thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join us and be part of this conversation. And we want to say a special thank you to all of our panelists who come from all over the country, from the West Coast, East Coast, various different organizations. We also have Delegate Gabriel Acevedo here as well with us. We're so honored to have you, Delegate, to share your experience and your thoughts on this very important topic. We're going to actually kick this off to our moderators. We have Iman Imran and Hannah Shreen, who are CAIR volunteers and representatives in Maryland, who are going to be moderating this conversation, kind of, navigating some of the very kind of complex and nuanced pieces of the census, inshallah. So with that, Iman and Hannah, I will kick it off to you and let you introduce the panelists and take it from here.
Thank you so much, Zainab. Again, welcome everyone. We're really excited to have you all here and engage in this dialogue, especially making it applicable to people so that they really see the importance of the census. And so before we introduce our wonderful panelists, just for our audience to know what the census even is, we're gonna let you know real quick. So the census essentially is constitutionally mandated, which is very interesting. I don't think a lot of people know that, but it's constitutionally mandated way for the government to really understand the population, what the makeup of the population is. And it's done for two reasons. First, to determine the number of seats in the House of Representatives, because it's done by population. And then the second is to distribute federal funds. So the census is actually very important and it can impact us in a very interesting way. And so that's kind of what Iman and I want to talk about with all of our panelists. So we'll start by introducing everyone. Iman, you want to kick us off?
Sure. So first we have Delegate Gabriel Acevedo, and he's a Maryland State Delegate representing the 39th District in Montgomery County.
Next, we have Robert McCaw, and he is the Government Affairs Director of the Council on American-Islamic Relations.
Thank you.
And we have, And we have Ms. Stephanie Adibe, who is a Deputy Director of the Howard County Department of Community Resources and Services.
Thank you.
We have Zahra Bilou, who is the Executive Director of the San Francisco chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations.
And we have Abid Ayoub, who is a National Legal and Policy Director at the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee.
And finally, Mr. Fazlul Kabir, who is a 5-term City Council member for the City of College Park, District 1. And so we have a lot of themes today that we'll be talking about, and Iman will kick us off with our first theme, which is kind of talking about diversity.
Yes, ma'am. So the first question that I have here is, what would the potential implications be if the census is not accurate?
I'll take a stab at that. So let me first say thank you to CAIR of Maryland for organizing and facilitating this really important discussion about the 2020 census, why we as Marylanders, but we as people of color and members of minority and marginalized groups must participate and ensure that we're filling out our census forms. As far as what the implications of us responding to the census are, well, at the federal level, the census and you responding to the census determines how the federal government spends $1 trillion in essence, right? And how much money in essence trickles down to our communities, what communities receive in terms of federal assistance. And then at the state level, where I serve in the Maryland General Assembly, the implications of folks responding to the census are you are in essence either taking away or adding to the political power of your community, because what the Maryland General Assembly or the Maryland State Legislature is charged with constitutionally is drawing congressional, legislative, as well as councilmanic districts. For the council member that's on this webinar as well, we draw congressional, legislative, and councilmanic districts. And so what that means is you can not only lose $1 trillion, well, not $1 trillion, but a slice of the $1 trillion federal pie, but at the state level, you could also lose political power. And so for people who belong to minority or marginalized groups, what we know oftentimes is that political power translates to our communities not only getting the resources that we need, but the kind of voice in conversations that impact us. And so it's critical for us to be participating for those two very reasons.
Very good.
I can chime in from what we're thinking from a small town like College Park. Most of you probably know College Park. We're a college town with a population of about 30,000 people. And we are known for the home of the University of Maryland, the state's flagship university. So we're talking about if in one of our city council meeting, if we can have just 5 seconds to tell someone what to tell them to convince why census is important. And that would be a figure, it's an $18,000 figure, meaning every time a resident does not fill out census, then the city will be losing that money over 10 years period, because census doesn't happen every year, it happens every 10 years. So that's a big chunk of money. And think about, say, thousands of people don't participate. That means we are losing millions of dollars. That's a big deal. In a small town like ours, that means that we'll be impacted by, in the field of like business development, jobs in healthcare resources, the school funding, the enhanced city services, and and Delegate already mentioned about the representation in the state and the federal level. Also, because we are a college town, the University of Maryland will be impacted, and they will be impacted big time in terms of things like school safety, like federal grants, like adult education grants, like agriculture, science, and engineering education, students' wellness programs, like medical assistance programs, the community mental health services. So there's so many different issues. Both the city and the university will be impacted, and it is important that we take these messages to our residents and the community. And it's not just like filling out a form. It's more than that. It's more about our future, how we will be providing services in the next 10 years.
Correct.
Okay. Absolutely. So real quick, just to continue the conversation on funding, I kind of want to ask Ms. Adibe about the programs that you have, that you know of, that are receiving census funding, and which communities will be impacted by that funding should they opt in or opt out of the census.
Absolutely. So federal funding supports a lot of programs that our communities and neighbors use every day. A few of the top funded programs include medical assistance, supplemental nutrition assistance, also known as the SNAP benefit, medical care, Medicare, the National School Lunch Program, college Pell Grants, Head Start, housing grants. So there are several federal funded programs that support our communities. And additionally, there are also several programs that may benefit the community even more during times of need, such as the pandemic that we are experiencing right now, such as unemployment insurance, energy assistance for low-income families, emergency shelter, and domestic violence prevention programs. Data from the 2020 census will determine how more than $600 billion in federal funds will be distributed to states throughout the county. And for every person not counted in the census, we lose. And by we, I mean our state, our county, and our communities lose over $18,000 in a 10-year span that will not go to support these critical programs and services that promote the economic stability of individuals and families.
Right. So,
and if I could just really quickly, just to put it on a familial level, as I'm talking to my constituents and folks in my community, you know, when we respond, when we as people of color, as Muslims, as people who belong to marginalized groups, when we respond to the census, we are doing our part to make sure that our communities get our fair share, right? And that goes to the whole underfunding part of things, right? We fund as a government and as someone that sits on the appropriations committee that oversees our state's capital and operating budget, we fund a lot of things, right? From our schools to transportation to housing, et cetera. But this is a conversation, this is a question about whether our communities receive our fair share of that funding, right? And this is on a more familial level why it's critically important for us as a community, for us as neighbors, to ensure that we're filling it out so we're getting the money that's owed to our communities, plain and simple.
To that, sorry, Hannah. So to that point, Delegate Acevero, the next question that I want to ask you is, you know, with the history of marginalizing communities of color, low-income communities, and immigrant communities in America, does filling out the census actually matter?
Yeah, it absolutely does, because we obviously use it to draw congressional districts. Population matters, whether you, regardless of your immigration status. This is why there is a fight going on right now to ensure that incarcerated people are given the right to vote, because incarcerated individuals are already counted as part of the census. Some jurisdictions, some states use incarcerated people as a way of sort of gaining greater political power in terms of congressional seats, et cetera. So if other people can understand the power of all of us, right, participating and all of us filling out the census, then surely we should have that sense of urgency to ensure that we're counting every single member of our household, regardless of immigration status. We want to ensure that wherever you live, that those communities have the funding for schools, for transportation, for housing, and for critical programs that really keep working families and folks who are low income solvent.
right. And I want to ask Mr. Ayub here about the importance of representation. So for, you know, I'm Middle Eastern, but I'm typically under the category white whenever I have to fill out my race on a form. So can you speak to the importance of communities like the Middle Eastern community rightfully saying which community they're a part of in the census?
Right, and thank you for that, and thank you for having this conversation. Look, unfortunately, the census, it's not going far enough in counting or having an accurate count on the Middle East community, the Middle East North African community in the country. Nonetheless, it's still important, as my colleagues have been saying, full representation on issues that matter here, issues that directly impact us and our neighbors, regardless of their ethnic or racial background or religious background in our communities. We need an accurate count in our communities. But a subset of these issues we face as a Middle Eastern community, as an Arab community, is how do you put an accurate count of who we are? And this has been an ongoing battle for decades, and not only for the Arab community or the Middle East community or the North African community. There's other communities out there who are just not counted. So when it comes down to time to break down demographics in the country, you know, where if you take millions of Arabs and you're putting them in the white category, then kind of what they're doing, you know, with the prisoners and others, inflating those numbers. So we're not getting an accurate depiction of the diversity of America and the makeup of America. So there have been a number of campaigns and a number of efforts to, you know, get more categories on there, get a way for us to be counted on there. There's been a lot of back and forth. And unfortunately, the census has been politicized. There was an effort to put the MENA box on there, Middle East, North African box, and then the Trump administration removed that box. You know, after a lot of work that's been done for the past decades, there was an effort to put a citizenship question on there. So there is a tendency by the right to politicize the census. They have an understanding, they have the knowledge, they know how powerful of a tool the census is. everything that they're doing, everything they've done over the past few decades has been a long game, forward vision of, if we control the census, the counting, we can gerrymander our districts. If we gerrymander our districts, we're controlling the House, the state legislatures. If we're controlling the state legislatures, then it's a domino effect. We're controlling everything. But the foundation of this, one of the big foundations on their agenda, is controlling the census. So that's why it's important to get out there and make sure that we complete this form. And it is a, it will go a long way over the next 10 years, especially with the politicalization of everything that we're seeing now. We do need to partake in this.
Hey, Abid, if I can jump in, what happens in 10 years from now if people of Middle Eastern and North African descent fill out the census in large numbers? Do we get that MENA question? Is it more likely?
I mean, I think the box is not dependent on the participation rate. I think, we need a high participation rate. Like my hometown of Dearborn, we're only at 61%. We got 40% more that we need to go. But it's going to be advocacy, and it's going to be a continued effort. What a lot of people realize is, in between these 10 years, when one census begins, when one census ends, the work on the other census immediately begins. So within a few months, 6 months or so, there's meetings taking place at the Census Bureau with advocates, with community leaders and community groups. Now, again, I don't know if this administration, if they're still in power, if they'll do that, but I do know in 2010, as soon as the census finished, the Obama administration was holding meetings with community folks for this upcoming census. So there's a lot of work in that 10-year period to get what we want on those forms.
Okay, so Mr. McCaw and Sister Zahra, this next question is kind of posed to both of you guys, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. So as Mr. Ayoub brought up earlier, the citizenship question was posed on the census last year, and it was struck down. So what are your thoughts on the question even being posed?
I definitely, ladies first, I guess.
Go ahead, it's okay.
All right, I really truly believe that the Department of Commerce, that this was a political strategy to decrease the amount of participation in this census. It is across the board with right-wing conservatives in the Trump administration to disenfranchise voters, to put out fake news that somehow that there's deception in voting, false voting happening. And they are really concerned that if there's an accurate count of minorities in the US, that this 9-panel screen we see before you, this is what the real Brady Bunch in 2030 would look like if they rebooted it, right? So there's a chance for us to really know what America looks like, and that really doesn't fall on the Trump administration's agenda. And having a citizenship question there would have definitely suppressed participation in the census, just like they wanted to remove the MENA question, so it could look like there were more people of my extraction than actually being from North Africa or the Middle East.
I agree with everything Robert is saying. One, this is, so first and foremost, obviously, thank you all of you for the work that you do for having this conversation. One of the things I remember from my early GOTV work, by the way, is that it's that person-to-person social contact that gets people to vote, right? So it's not just the flyers or the emails, it's also the work that all of us do in our communities. And so I'm really appreciative that you all are committed to helping people in our communities turn out for the census, because if that's what it takes all of us. I think about the citizenship question is that it follows a trend, of course, a trend or an agenda that we've seen from the Trump administration, which is an explicitly anti-immigrant agenda. That is how he campaigned. That is what he was working on in his first month in office. And we know even just as recently as 2 weeks ago, we are looking at a new immigration ban that effectively bars almost all legal immigration to the United States. So it should be no surprise to us that they were looking for additional ways, right, to silence minorities, to invisibilize minorities, and to scare them. I struggle with having been grateful that the Supreme Court blocked the question, because they didn't fully block it. They just blocked it for this time, which means that it's important, by the way, that we keep fighting back, that we keep saying, hey, this isn't okay. But the administration, though they didn't get the question on there, did still scare lots of people, right? So I was personally, as a civil rights attorney, already concerned about confidentiality on the census. Now, You add this whole debate about the citizenship question. You know that the Trump administration is pissed because they lost that fight, and it makes the confidentiality question even more sensitive. And so the outcome, though there is no question on the census, is we are reminded that this administration is white supremacist, fascist in nature, and is attempting to invisibilize and scare anyone that looks any differently. That said, we have to continue to remind our communities that it's not on there, right? That the citizenship question is not on there, that it's so important that we're answering the ethnicity and national origin question in the way that ADC and others have recommended that we do, and that we remember that it's confidential. But they've created, and I hate to sound like I'm complaining about more work, but they've created more work for those of us that are community ambassadors to have to go out into the community and say, well, we know that they're terrible, and we know that they're evil, and we know that they hate all of us, but they lost to this one fight. And so please fill out the census.
And as just with regards to confidentiality, a lot of people are always concerned, well, is the census going to lead to like a list of Muslims or a list of Latinos in the United States? And I can tell you, anyone that's just worked with big numbers for voting, if you look at all the voter data sets out there, if you look at the credit card reporting numbers they have, where they've, through different databases, have already cataloged every single person living in the United States, and with just about $30,000 to $40,000, you could create a list of any category of person in the United States if you wanted to from the private sector. So I'm confident in the confidentiality of the census. I'm under no false illusions that they couldn't create a list, and they already do have a list of Muslims. It's called the watch list. Dearborn has a very high percentage in there. And that's just because it's racist and bigoted. But that all said, just going back to the census, it's safe, it is secure, and don't be afraid to take it, because if there was someone with bad intentions, not to be a bummer, they could do it by other means.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate Zara for just pointing out the challenges that are facing as a result of the kind of anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and Islamophobic rhetoric and narrative that we've seen from this administration, because that makes our work harder on the ground. But that is work that we as community leaders, organizers, activists should not be doing on our own. And so state government plays a role in ensuring that we are working with those community leaders to develop the kind of a culturally relevant and appropriate messaging, so that these communities understand that the census is important, it is safe, and it is confidential. And that was one of the concerns that I raised at a committee hearing with our Department of Planning that is responsible for our state's census count. And just questioning whether we're working with those community leaders on messaging, right? Because the state obviously sources can help those communities by working with them and developing the message and then putting it out to those communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a very important point here, that confidentiality component. I think a lot of people worry about putting their data out there, but as we're talking about, it's important to do so because it directly ties into the programs that can benefit a lot of communities. And on that note, I want to bring back Ms. Adibe and Mr. Kabir on the topic of the communities who are receiving help from a lot of the programs receiving funding. And, you know, we talked about programs like TANF, and a lot of these programs, people who are receiving aid from them could be part of homeless communities or communities who don't have access to the knowledge of completing the census. From that perspective, how do we encourage, as people who do know and do have knowledge about the census, to get others who are part of those communities, like homeless communities, active in making their voices heard in the census? Ms. Adiba, we'll start with you.
Absolutely. It's really just making sure, like as a lot of folks on the call have already mentioned, just making sure that they have a general understanding of the census to, eliminate any fears that they have going into them. So letting them know that their responses are safe and their voice is important, even though they are, part of a vulnerable population, that their responses still benefit the community as a whole, and that their individual contribution is worth over $18,000 in federal funding that supports a lot of the resources that that our communities benefit from.
Right, Mr. Kabir.
Yeah, thank you. So we're a small town and we are trying our best, and our community is pretty diverse in College Park. About 50%, and I'm looking at the past census, which happened in 2010. About 50% of our residents are white. I believe it's 48, and 19% African American, Hispanic 17%, and the rest is 16%, which includes Asian Americans and Middle Easterns. And definitely there isn't any category of Middle Eastern in this. So we are pretty diverse community, and it is important that we reach out to the community in every possible way. About a year ago, we received about our budget was about $70,000, and part of that came from a state grant of about $35,000, which is a matching grant of about $4 million in different communities in Maryland. And the city has its own complete count committee, and I believe every community has it. It's a residents committee, and they've been trying their best, and they've been really driving the outreach effort to all the different diverse community within the city. They're doing social media, email blast, the weekly bulletin that we have every week. There is the message has been included for participation in the website. We have a dedicated space on Census 2020. We have a monthly newsletter where we've been continuously publishing. We also are putting lawn signs, which is pretty interesting. It's kind of innovative, I found, at the corner of the streets, on our parks and the trails in the neighborhoods, both in English and Spanish, because Hispanic community is one of the marginalized community we recognize. Unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 situation, College Park got hit big time, and because we are a college town and most of the students left, and they are a big part of the community. And I was checking the response rate last night on census.gov site. Our response rate is pretty low now. It's less than 40%, and that means we have a long way to go.
Wow.
And the school doesn't open, then we'll continue to lose this response rate. The university has been trying their best to reach out to the students because the online virtual classes is still going. So I'm sure the professors have been asking the students to fill out the census forms, because they should be actually filling out as part of College Park, because that's where they actually spend most of the time. We were planning to do a big community event in one of our city park, bringing all the residents in there and filling out census form on their behalf. Unfortunately, that was scheduled just 1 week after the lockdown was announced. So that had to be canceled. So we're thinking to have a virtual meeting like that. So we're really worried. And as you mentioned, some of you mentioned before about the fear about the questions that the citizenship questions. Thankfully, it's not on the paper now. However, I believe the damage has already been done. And there's a fear and there's a nervousness and there's a lack of trust in the minority community to fill out. And because of COVID-19, with a very high unemployment we currently have, it just jumped from 4 or 5% to 20% and more now within a month. People are more worried about their basic necessities like food, housing, and rents. So the census is probably not as important as other things they currently are thinking of.
I just wanted to add, you mentioned the Complete Count Committee, and I just wanted to stress the importance of leveraging those relationships. It's utilizing the Complete Count Committee and our partners in the communities, the nonprofits, the faith communities, and the communities and networks that have relationships with the people that we're trying to outreach, the people who are considered hard to count or difficult to enumerate. So we are stressing the importance of those relationships and using them to get the trusted message out to the community through the populations that they're already connected to and already serving on a daily basis.
Yeah, something that we're doing in California that I think that could work well for religious communities, by the way, is actually recognizing that we're not always just the best messenger ourselves. And so we've reached out to religious leaders, for example, and asked them to make selfie videos to be like,
Absolutely.
hey, like, you have a congregation, they're more likely to listen to you than me just because they know you, right? And they see me as the advocate, but they see you as their religious leader. So can you like film a 30 to 60-second video that says, this is why Muslims need to get counted, right? And that strategy can be applied to Muslims across the country, but also different groups. And so for folks tuning in, wondering how can I leverage my mosque to mobilize on the census, particularly when the mosque is closed, get your imam to put out a selfie video.
And jumping off of that, it's already passed, but Friday, April 3rd was National Muslim Census Day, and that was coordinated between CAIR California and the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, where other members like the Mosque CAIRs, ICNA, MAS, through their affiliated mosque and centers, the imams did issue greetings to the community on that day, where they also highlighted the importance of the census. And working with USCMO, CAIR is encouraging other Muslim community leaders to continue to put that messaging out. So we can't hit the grassroots like our chapters awesomely do. Thank you, Zara. But we are trying to go from a top-down approach.
And there's got to be creative ways to get people out there to fill it, to complete the census. I've noticed that a lot of these young kids are using the TikTok thing. And
I'm personally not a fan, and I'm a young person.
I don't even know. I'm still trying to figure out what it is.
Say like the young kids and the TikTok, like
wow. The TikTok and there's a lot of like comedians and
nothing to add to that.
There's a lot of comedians that are on it and a lot of clips that we're seeing, and it's working because if you looked at the and I've been tracking the numbers. We've been tracking the numbers in high areas like Michigan, like Dearborn, where a few weeks ago you were at 35-40%. But then when there was like these rush of videos and different things that these youngsters are putting out there, it's going up. It's a little over 60%, and it'll slowly increase. But we got to get creative in reaching folks that are at home now. And I believe, someone could correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they even extended the deadline of when the census forms need to be completed. So I think we have a little bit more time. We have an opportunity here. People are at home, so webinars like this do help. But I think for folks out there that have shorter attention spans and watch these 30-second clips, 40-second clips, putting stuff out there in the universe will get people to understand the importance of the census.
Absolutely. And with most of the country under stay-at-home orders, we have a captive audience. So it's really good to kind of think outside of the box and take advantage of any, opportunity. There's no really wrong way to kind of encourage someone to respond to the census.
And I just want to put a FYI out there. It takes literally several minutes. We're not talking like 10 or 5 even. If you're just a single person household, it takes literally 3 minutes to complete the census. If you have a couple kids, it takes about 5 or 6 minutes. It's really simple and straightforward. It's not a 20-question survey. They just want to know, are you, who lives in your household, and their backgrounds. And it's a matter of minutes to complete.
And to make it even easier, you can call in to give your response to the census. So if you're still working right now, if you're a part of the folks that are still commuting on your drive, to your job, you can, hands-free of course, but you can complete your census with someone from the Federal Census Bureau over the phone.
So please don't be driving to your job if you're not an essential worker.
Absolutely.
Big fact. That's very true.
You take your screen during one of your 20 Zoom calls during the day, you blink out for a second, you hit mute, and you fill out that census.
Excellent demonstration there. I like it.
We appreciate it. So, to jump to the next point, I want to talk about redistricting for a second. And my question directly kind of goes to the delegate and Mr. Ayub, but everybody else feel free to jump in. So I want to start with Mr. Ayub. Can you explain redistricting, right, and how the census can impact redistricting? And then the delegate,
Sure.
Could you speak to how the census would specifically impact legislative districts in Maryland?
Sure. So, I mean, just for example, your House of Representatives, our congressional makeup is divided up according to the census. So you'll take a state like, Virginia, Maryland, Michigan, use whatever example you want, depending on its population, is how the districts are carved up. So if you got, to get into a little bit of what gerrymandering will be, is sometimes they'll carve out their districts. So, Democrats are all in one place and, Republicans are scattered. So the map will look a little weird in states where you have, heavy Republican influence, which gerrymandered and carved out those districts. But the House of Representatives is just one clear-cut example. That's obvious that, it is determined by census. So there will be a redistricting shortly after the census in 2021. Now, each state, how they redistrict is dependent on the state. I know in Michigan, they just passed some laws in the past, couple of years where it's a commission that determines the redistricting. In some states, it's the state legislature, which determines how these districts are made up. That's when you begin seeing, Democrats having their districts merged. So you may have two representatives, for neighboring districts in Maryland that are Democrats, but after the redistricting, their their district becomes merged into one. One of them drops out. Republicans gain a representative. We lose or Democrats lose a representative. So there's a lot of games that go into, and a lot of politicking that goes into the way the redistricting does occur. Even delegate counts, when you have the general election, when you have, this, California is this many state delegates, or, for the presidential election, New York is this many delegates. That's dependent on the census. So you'll see, every 10 years, you'll see delegate counts, and some states go up, some states go down. So it's important to have a full count across the state, not only in your districts, but across the state, so you can have a stronger say in that delegate count when it comes time for general election. So your state is not overlooked. Your state is not an Idaho or a Wyoming where you have 3 delegates or so, and people are not coming there. But the higher the delegate count, of course, the way our electoral system is set up, the more attention you're going to get from from presidential candidates, and the more of our people that fill out the census, the more of a say you have in that state, the stronger we are politically, and the more sway we have politically in these elections. So you can see it's this census builds on everything that you want to do moving forward and building political capital and influence in these structures.
Absolutely. And Mr. Assefer, can you speak on how these districts are impacting communities in Maryland?
Yeah, sure. And let me just say, I think we just lost some viewership from Idaho there. Yeah, just a little bit. But as was rightly mentioned, the state legislature, after the census count, then draws congressional districts. So when we talk about federal politics, and when we talk about the toxicity of federal politics and the sort of conversations around the Muslim community, around immigrants, right now, that is dictated by the census and by your state legislature, who draws these congressional districts. What that also means at the state level is that we draw state legislative districts. Now, Maryland is a multi-member legislative district state, meaning that for every district in Maryland, you have, well, not every, but in most districts in Maryland, you have 3 members to the House of Delegates, and you have 1 state senator for each district. So you have 141 members in the House and 47 in the Senate. And so that drawing of legislative districts is also determined by the census. So the Muslim community, for example, can be growing, and based on the census, based on that growth, we are a proportional representation, state and country. We would then draw districts based on that population. So there's potential for communities gaining another legislative seat or losing. But certainly, as we see in Prince George's County, there was a district that was created because of the growth in the Latinx population, and that's District 47B. That's currently represented by my good friend and colleague, Delegate Wanika Fisher. But that's just an example of how, as population grows, as people participate in the census, as we as a representative democracy, we draw our lines based on the census. And so when you participate, then your community, again, gains that political power because you have a greater say in our state's capital right now. And also council money as well. So as the council member can speak to, you know, there is also that as well. So it really impacts you at every single level of government.
Absolutely. And so I want to bring in Zahra here to talk about the importance of Muslims filling out the census, because I think a lot of members in our community, even among youth, we might think, oh, it's just me, it's just one person, it doesn't really count. So how do we tell people, no, it actually matters? And we've heard from our wonderful panelists today that, yeah, this matters in a lot of ways. So how can we hone in and tell people, listen, you got to fill this out?
So interestingly, what I've heard is that the money piece is actually more compelling for some members of our community than the political representation piece, because they're so disenchanted with the mess that is our political system that, like, more or less representation. I agree it matters, but if I'm not, you know, in a grouping of people already in the 40 or 60% that have already filled out the census, right, then I'm like so disenchanted and so disconnected that, like, more or less representation may not move me. And I don't mean to say that it's not important. I agree it's very important. But I think that one of the things that we should really be leaning on in talking to members of the Muslim community is the resources, right? So these are resources that we pay for. As I believe Robert and Abed had mentioned before, that's our money. Like, it's just a matter of getting it back. And every dollar that's not spent on domestic aid is, by the way, spent on foreign aid, right? Which is military aid, which is like wars abroad, right? And so that for me is like, if I am so upset with the government and think that, like, I hate Donald Trump and I hate Joe Biden and, like, I just hate everything, right? Like, why should I bother? The idea of getting back the money that I put into a corrupt and unjust system so that I can help people in my neighborhood I think would move me, right? And so that's the thing that we've really been talking to a lot of people about is it's $10,000 to $20,000 per person that is undercounted, right? Which is millions, if not billions of dollars. And there is something really compelling about doing that in this moment right now, where we can see what a mess our, like, federal resources are. We can see how recklessly, I was just reading an article today about some of the ridiculous contracts New York State ended up in to buy ventilators that never showed up, right? Like, some guy tweeted at the president, the state of New York sent him $69 million for ventilators, and the ventilators never delivered. And I'm like, oh my God, right? Like, this is money that is ours and they are spending it recklessly. And one of the ways I can make sure I gain control of it and that it is used in the best way possible, in addition to, of course, having the right political leadership, is also having been counted. The last thing I'll say, I think that is, you know, for me, really important about Muslims is our religion dictates that we be visible, right? That we be outspoken, that we be proud. And though the census does not ask us what our faith is, for many of us, we come from undercounted communities, ethnically, socioeconomically, and geographically. And so it's very much a religious dictate that I stand up and that I speak out, right? As an activist, one of the teachings that I always go back to is that if we see an injustice, we should stop it with our hands. And if we can't stop it with our hands, then we stop it with our words, right? And the census is those things. Like, I am taking action I am speaking out and I am making myself visible and known so that my values, my principles, the way I want us to spend our money, the people I want elected are voiced, right? Like they're represented. That's what happens when I fill out the census. And so there's the like political piece, which I think is really compelling for those of us that like still have the audacity to hope that something can change in our political system. There is the resource piece, which I think works really, really well for people who are like, you know, screw the political system. It sucks. It's all a mess. I hate it. Okay, but like, get me my money back, right? Like we paid into this, get me my money back. And then I think the religious angle is a really important one too. And this is one that we're talking to religious leaders about, is our faith tells us to stand up and be proud of who we are. And the census is a medium for doing that.
Right. And so sorry, did I cut somebody off?
No, I was actually going to just add real quickly that, you know, if we look at social movements, every social movement has largely been led by young people, and young people understand the role that political power plays in social change. And so while I completely agree, there's this apathy towards politics and politicians, you know, we understand the importance of political power in changing the conditions on the ground in our communities. And so I think for me, just one of the things that I've always pointed out to, you know, folks in my generation as a millennial, you know, I'm just reminded of you know, words from folks like Plato, who once said that, you know, the punishment for people who don't pay attention to the affairs of the public is to be ruled by evil men or women, and how that plays out, because the census is something that is the affairs of the public, right? It is the way we set up our system of government, who gets what amount of representation, who gets what share of the pie, right? And so we may not think that politics is important, but you know who thinks politics is important? Our landlords, you know, the big insurance folks, right? And those are the folks who are participating in your democracy and in your government. And so the census is one way for you to participate in your democracy, because democracy comes from the Greek word demos, meaning the people. And the census is very much about the people, right? If we can't count how many people are living in our community, we cannot ensure that we're providing the kind of strong democracy that we often bomb other countries under the auspices of, you know, democratization. That has to start here. And we have to ensure that we're meeting people where they are in their communities, and to recognize that young people are very much in tune with politics, even though they're frustrated with some of the political figures right now. They're very much in tune with politics and understand the implications of the decisions of folks in power. We just have to ensure that we're engaging them, because that's part of the problem. You know, folks in power have never engaged the people on the ground and the people most impacted. And that's where we come in. And to just add really quickly about the work of the Maryland General Assembly in 2018, we passed, the legislature passed legislation that provides $5 million in grants to community organizations and local jurisdictions, because we believe that trusted leaders and community leaders like CAIR and others should play a role in not just messaging, in not just reaching people where they are, but also getting out the count, as we say. Just like we talk about getting out the vote, getting out the count, and ensuring that people are not just aware, but they're participating, right? Because people can be aware of an election and not participate. I am very much aware that the census is taking place right now, but I couldn't care to participate. And so we want to make sure that we're turning out that count as well.
I just very briefly, if I may, from a Muslim's perspective, on an extent, what has been said is not only taking care of our own interest, Muslims' interest, but also taking care of our neighbors' interest. And that's what each and every Muslim should be. And that's what the Islam actually teaches us. Think about Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him. He used to care about other people. And even before he became prophet, he formed something called Hilful Fudl, meaning an organization that cared about the safety of other people in the community. So every time a Muslim does not fill out a census form, that means he is impacting or she is impacting his neighbors or her neighbors. And both of their neighbors will be going to the same schools. Both of the neighbors will be served by the same police cars on the streets. And it is about the community more than us. And this is the message I think our imams and from the masjids and the faith leaders should be taking out to the community. I think when you connect this kind of drive with our teaching, the message that the original teaching of Islam, then I think people will be more motivated in accepting that.
Definitely. Now, Iman, I heard that we have a question from an audience member.
Yes, we do. So the census doesn't ask about religion. How can Muslims be counted? And then this person is saying that this is the first time that they were able to put as Palestinian for the ethnicity. Should I have put Palestinian Arab instead of just Palestinian? Whoever wants to jump in, go ahead.
Well, on the Arab Palestinian part, so what we've been telling people is to skip. I don't have the form in front of me, but if you go down to like some other race, and I think a few questions before that, it goes, is your race Lebanese or Egyptian? I think that's kind of like a ploy to get you to count as white. So skip down to a few questions where it says the box will say some other race. Click that box and then write in there Palestinian or Palestinian American or Arab, Egyptian, Lebanese, Saudi, whatever your background is in that some other race box, and it will be counted. But if you go up a few boxes above where it says, Lebanese and Egyptian in parentheses, and you put it in there, that's going to be counted towards white.
Okay. So,
Lovely.
Anybody else want to jump in real quick to answer that question, or?
So I agree with Abid, and I think this has been a really important moment for us to lean in on the expertise at the ADC. And so thank you, Abid, for that input. But also, I know I've been sending, I had a friend who's Egyptian, and she's like, I'm not white. What do I do? And I was like, well, look at what ADC says, right? Do not mark white if you are Egyptian, please. On the Muslim piece, and I'd love to hear from others too on this, but my thought is the census does not count Muslims. That doesn't mean that Muslims don't get counted, right? So we know that we have large populations in a number of ethnic minority groups. And so when we all step forward and we fill out the census, our community as a collective benefits, and we fulfill our religious obligation to take action, right? As Brother Fazlul was saying, it's not just about me, it's about how I make the community and society around me better. And so that's the thing. And we don't want them to count Muslims, for the record, that. We want them to count Arabs. We want those categories built out over the next 10 years. We do not and will not be advocating for a religious question on the census. It's very important that we protect the First Amendment and not have the government asking us those questions. But that doesn't change that we have an obligation to step forward.
Yeah. And contrary to popular belief, not all Arabs are Muslim. I think a lot of people struggle with that one. But
right.
Go ahead, Delegate.
No, I completely agree with everything that was said. It's just recognizing the diversity within the Muslim community. I mean, the Muslim community is a large and very diverse community. And when everyone participates, the Muslim community as a whole benefits. But I appreciate, the recognition of not just that diversity, but also the intersectionality, because there are challenges in some of these communities. There are a lot of people who are Muslim who also, belong to hard to count or undercount communities, right? And so as a faith, certainly understanding that, there's a responsibility to ensure that all of our people are counted, that everyone matters. that is critical, and I agree. I think it's just recognizing that diversity, and while it is, they don't ask you whether you're a Muslim on the census, you do count. So please fill it out.
Right.
My2020census.gov.
Definitely. And so as we wrap up to our final two questions, I want to ask the panel what your respective organizations are doing to get people aware of and involved with taking the census. And Mr. McCall, we want to start with you in understanding what CAIR has done to get people aware of what the census is.
Well, I'm really lucky that CAIR is a national organization that has a network of chapters. I know once a week I call in, but our chapters from the ground up are in the communities. They're leading these efforts, and we're just trying to enhance the messaging. So if one of our chapters like California can do great work in producing locally tailored materials, and then we can translate them, we're going to help them and put that out. We can work at CAIR National. I'll let Zahra talk to our chapters, but as national, we just want to keep on promoting the consistent message that the census is active. This call itself is a product of the CAIR National Office. And we are going to continue working with other national Muslim organizations like the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations, ICNA, MAS, reminding them through these institutes that just because the census arrived in the mail, that doesn't mean it's done. The work continues.
I think there's a number of things. And so in California, and I think across the country, we've been doing phone banks. So a lot of times our outreach used to be in person. We know we can't do that right now. And so we're calling homes and saying, hey, like, let's make sure that you get counted. And so folks who want to help with phone banking can contact their local CAIR chapter. Empower Change, another one of our partners who's also working on the census, is also doing phone banking. So that's a really easy thing that people can do from home. They can call 10, 20, like, houses, have some really great conversations. It helps with the loneliness of sitting in social distancing too. And you're advocating for change. Among the other things I mentioned, that we are working with religious leaders to get them to incorporate census messaging into some of their work, so that people who might not be tuned into CAIR but are tuned into the khutbah or are tuned into a spiritual talk are hearing about the census. In addition to that, I think just ongoing online conversations, right? So continuing to say, hey, like, who else has filled out the census? But the thing I'll offer that people who aren't, maybe someone's listening in and they're like, oh, I'm not with an organization, I don't have capacity to volunteer, what can I do? Fill out the census, take a selfie of yourself having done so, and post it on the internet, and then tag your next 5 friends, right? One of my friends talks about how if everybody would just tag 5, we would get a lot done. And so if everybody in that 40 or 60% filled out the census, tagged 5 other friends on social media and said, hey, like, have you done it? Confirm, and then tag the next 5, right? Like, so easy, but we know that personal contact makes a significant difference.
Right.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Anything from anybody else?
Sure. So the Department of Community Resources and Services is actually leading the census initiative for Howard County, and through relationships with our Complete Count Committee, as well as county partners in the nonprofit sector or the faith community or other cultural community groups, we're informing the county, we're informing residents of the county of what the census is and the importance of them completing the census. We have several advertising campaigns going on. We have advertisements on our county buses. We have print and digital advertising campaigns with the Baltimore Sun local newspapers. We have advertisements with Howard County newspapers, as well as newspapers with the Korean communities. We have advertising on social media. We're also doing phone banking. We have hosted and presented at various community events and meetings to inform residents about the importance of the census. So we're pretty much just kind of working with our county partners to make sure that we encourage and inform residents about the census.
Okay. So my last question to all the panelists here is, in 10 seconds, what is one piece of advice that you would give to somebody who's on the fence about filling out the census?
I'll jump in. Just, if you thought that your state didn't have enough funding for SNAP during this coronavirus crisis, you could have had more money if your community fully filled out the census. And that's how important it is.
Great. Mr. Ayub?
Bro, look, we know there's going to be some fear in completing the census. We know that there's going to be some concern about the census, and these concerns at times are warranted. This country doesn't have the greatest history when it comes to information sharing and gathering. But I'll tell you this much, and I think Robert alluded to it earlier. If they wanted to put a list together of Muslims or of Arabs, they don't need the census to do that. In fact, they're probably already doing it. It's probably already done. Separate the concerns. Nobody is, diminishing the fears, diminishing the concerns. What we're saying is this census is far more secure than other aspects or other parts of the government and other information gathering programs that the government's implemented. But we do need to, it is good for our community. It's good for us to complete the census, to get it out and get it in. Don't be on the fence. Get it in, get it out there, and then get your friends to do it as well. Let's get these numbers up.
Yeah, just I would just ask folks, do you like losing money? Because that's really what the census is about. Whether you participate or not will determine if and how much money you and your community loses. And I think when we ask that straightforward question, do you like losing money? We get to the heart of the issue, which is your pockets are going to be hit, your community is going to be hit by you not participating. And let me just add really quickly from the earlier question, I represent one of the most diverse districts in the state and in our country. And I recognize, not just as an immigrant, not just as someone who is Afro-Latino, the challenges of our communities being counted and our communities, mattering to not just state government, but to federal government as well. And one of the things that I've been doing is not just calling constituents during this pandemic to make sure they're doing well, but also to remind them that you can fill out your census form to provide any information, but also to speak with those trusted leaders. We have to come back to those trusted leaders and voices in the community. I represent, and I'm proud to represent, a large and growing Muslim community here in District 39, and the Islamic Society of Germantown does a lot of great work in our community and with the Muslim community. And we have been ensuring that we're working with all of those stakeholders, all of those trusted voices and leaders to get that word out.
Thank you, Delegate. Yeah, I think if we posed your question in a TikTok, we'd be solid.
Right. Like losing.
Yeah.
If I had the opportunity to make a TikTok video, so for the first thing I'll be putting out is $18,200.
Right, exactly.
I'll be asking direct question: do you really want to lose this money? And if you really want to lose this money, then get ready for this: that your kids will be getting underfunded school services, school education. The police will not be coming as often you see now. The roads might not be repaired, even though
that might be in some communities that are over criminalized and over policed. That might be a good thing.
Yep.
Some people complain, believe it or not, they don't see police officers.
Sometimes when
we don't see police officers. Teacher, I think you might have just talked me out of the census.
Yeah.
Sometimes when people look at the programs that are supported either in whole or in part by census funding, they don't always make the connection because they don't feel that they directly benefit from some of these services. So in instances like that, it's not always doing it for yourself. It's doing it for your county, for your community, for your neighbor. You completing the census today, you're doing it for the future of our kids for the next 10 years. So it's important.
I know this is due 10 seconds, but there's a question in here that I just want to make sure gets addressed. I saw some residents are afraid that their personal information will be shared with ICE and immigration. How can you ensure that this doesn't happen? So it's a very reasonable concern. Like, I don't blame people for being afraid. I mentioned earlier, I'm a civil rights attorney. I've worked in national security for a decade. And I was like, I'm not giving my information to this administration. The law protects us, right? So census data is confidential. That is a legal requirement of the census data. But the thing I've also been saying to my community is you better believe that CAIR and everyone on this webinar who's encouraging you to fill out the census will absolutely have your back and fight for you should this worst case scenario happen. So I can guarantee it because right now it is confidentially, it's legal, it's confidential according to the law, right? So that's why I can guarantee it, because the law says. Now, if this government were to try to break the law, I can guarantee you, I think on behalf of everyone on this webinar, that we would have your back, that we would be at your house, that we would be anywhere that they were trying to target you, and that we would fight really, really hard for you. And so it is a, you know, what is it? It's like, I want you to be sure, and I also want you to know that you can count on us should something happen. But right now, there is no reports, there are no concerns, there are no instances of data being shared outside with other agencies. And so rest assured, we would not be advising you to do something that we were not ourselves doing and encouraging our families to do. The last time I was on a census webinar, my mom, you know, WhatsApped me in the middle of the webinar to be like, I just wanted you to know that I filled it out already. And I was like, okay, good, right? And I would tell you to do something that I'm not comfortable having my mom do. My encouragement on filling out the census, and I've exceeded my 10 seconds, is look, 10 questions, 10 years. What you do with these 10 questions right now impacts you, your family, your community, and our country for the next 10 years. If you thought 3.5 years of President Trump, I can't even say the words, felt too long, imagine what 10 years of bad representation or inadequate representation or short funding will mean. Yep. So 10 questions, 10 years. And then what I'll say for Muslims is speaking up, standing up, and taking action is what our faith requires. It is you acting on your faith to fill out the census, to say, see, here I am. I want my values to inform the system. And I'd like to think that if we make the intention to do it to better our communities in the month of Ramadan, that God will reward us with the exponential blessings that this month brings.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of our panelists for this outstanding conversation. I definitely learned a lot. I'm very hopeful, and I'm sure that our audience has learned a lot as well. And on behalf of CAIR, we want to see you again. I mean, hopefully we'll have another panel on another topic. And we really appreciate your time being here today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, CAIR.
Bye-bye.
Bye.